May 14th, 1852. A young man steps onto the slave block of the St. Louis Hotel. Every newspaper calls him the most beautiful human ever sold in Louisiana. 7 witnesses will later swear he was already legally free, and the man who bought him for a king's ransom knew it. The Mississippi at dusk doesn't merely flow, it breathes. Thick, slow, ancient, a ribbon of liquid copper under a bruised violet sky, carrying the scent of cane juice, river mud, and distant death. On the Levee Road north of New Orleans, the live oaks lean together like conspirators, their beards of Spanish moss swaying as if whispering secrets no living soul should ever hear. 43 miles upriver, hidden behind that green tunnel, lies a kingdom built on blood and sugar. Richest plantation. The name itself feels like a prayer and a curse in the same breath. In the spring of 1852, the great house still gleamed white as bone against the fever-green fields. 3 stories of Creole arrogance, galleries wrapped like mourning veils, columns shipped from France before Napoleon ever dreamed of selling Louisiana. At night, candlelight flickered behind jalousies, and if you stood on the riverbank, you could almost believe the house floated, an ark of wealth sailing on an ocean of human sorrow. Inside that house, a man who believed himself righteous weighed the soul of his own blood against 30 pieces of silver. Monsieur Anatole Desire Devereaux, 56 years old, widower, childless in the way that mattered to inheritance, sat alone in his study on an evening when the air itself felt heavy with coming ruin. A single oil lamp burned. The rest of the house was dark. The servants dismissed early, the dogs strangely silent. On the cypress desk before him lay a letter. The paper was cheap, the ink already browning, the handwriting trembling like a dying man's pulse. Christophe was dying. Anatole's younger brother, charming, reckless Christophe, who had fled to Paris 25 years earlier rather than face the consequences of marrying a woman with one drop too many of the wrong blood. Christophe, who had sent proud announcements of a son born in 1829. Jean-Baptiste, a name like a cathedral bell. Anatole had answered that announcement with silence and exile. He had paid the allowance, yes, every franc wired across the Atlantic like clockwork, but he had severed the brother from the family tree as cleanly as a surgeon cuts away gangrene. Christophe had accepted the sentence. For a quarter-century, the Devereaux of Louisiana pretended Paris had swallowed their black sheep whole. Now, Paris was spitting something back. Anatole read the pleading words again. Consumption. 3 months, perhaps less. A brilliant boy, Sorbonne-educated, multilingual, gentle, left penniless and alone. One final request. Take him in. Not as family. Christophe understood that was impossible, but as secretary, tutor, anything. Anything to keep the boy from starving in a city that would soon forget he ever existed. Anatole set the letter down and stared at the portrait of his father on the wall. The old man's eyes, cold, Norman blue, looked back without mercy. In the lamplight, the painted face seemed almost to move. A practical man, Anatole told himself, solves problems before they fester. He rose, walked to the window, and looked out over the quarters. 100 small cabins huddled in rows, lamplight flickering behind rags stuffed in broken windows. 217 souls who woke before dawn to feed the grinding mills with their bodies. 217 reasons why Louisiana law was very clear. Any traceable African ancestry, no matter how faint, no matter how many generations removed, made a person property. The idea came to him not as lightning, but as slow poison spreading through the veins. Jean-Baptiste was coming. The boy would arrive looking like something carved by Michelangelo. Christophe's bone structure, the mother's dangerous beauty, refined into something that could pass for pure European aristocracy. In New Orleans, men would kill for such a creature. In the fancy girl auctions at the St. Louis Hotel, light-skinned youths who could recite Latin and play Chopin on command fetch prices that made even the richest planters blush. Anatole turned from the window. His reflection in the dark glass looked suddenly unfamiliar. Older, hollow-cheeked, the face of a man bargaining with demons he had always pretended not to see. He sat again and wrote his reply. "Come," he told his dying brother. "I will receive your son. Send him at once." He did not sign it, "Your loving brother." Only a Devereaux. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, so hot the river seemed to steam, the steamboat Etoile du Matin nosed against the private landing at Rivière-aux-Chênes. The whistle moaned like a lost soul. Anatole waited on the levee with his overseer Gaines, a thick-necked Kentuckian with pale eyes and a constant half-smile that never reached them, and 3 house servants who knew better than to speak unless spoken to. They saw the passenger before he saw them. He stepped onto the gangplank as if the wood might burn his feet, moving with the unconscious grace of someone raised in salons rather than fields. Tall, 6 feet and perhaps an inch more. Shoulders narrow but proud. A coat of fine dark wool, once expensive, now shining at the elbows and cuffs turned once to hide the fraying. 1 leather valise, old but good, the brass lock scratched from years of travel. Then he lifted his face to the sun. Even Gaines, who had seen every shade of beauty the trade could produce, caught his breath. The young man's hair was black and waved like raven wings, long enough to brush the collar in the Parisian fashion. His skin was ivory warmed by a whisper of gold. No one would ever guess the secret running beneath it. Cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. A mouth made for poetry and lies. And the eyes, dew tout puissant. The eyes were the green gold of cathedral glass when sunlight strikes it, framed by lashes so long they cast shadows on his cheeks. He looked like absolution and damnation in the same breath. Anatole felt something inside his chest crack, just a little. For one unguarded second, he saw Christophe at 23, laughing in the moonlight of this very levee, daring the world to deny him anything. Then the moment passed, and the crack sealed over with calculation. Jean-Baptiste descended the gangplank, every step deliberate. He set the valise down on the raw planks and straightened, meeting Anatole's stare without flinching. "Monsieur Devereaux," he said in French, so pure it sounded like music. The accent was Paris, the Paris of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, not the rough Creole of the colony. "I am Jean-Baptiste, son of Christophe. I place myself under your protection, and I thank you." His voice was low, cultured, steady, a voice that had never begged for anything in its life. Anatole did not offer his hand. He studied the boy the way a butcher studies a calf, looking for flaws, for value, for the cleanest cut. Up close, the perfection was almost offensive. Not a scar, not a blemish. The hands were scholar's hands, long-fingered, uncalloused, the nails trimmed and clean despite the journey. A faint scent of bergamot and old books clung to him, as if he carried the Sorbonne library in his coat pocket. Anatole's gaze flicked to Gaines. The overseer's half-smile had widened into something hungry. "Follow me," Anatole said at last, turning on his heel. He did not look back to see if the boy obeyed. They walked the crushed shell path beneath the avenue of oaks. Sunlight dripped through the moss in thin, trembling shafts. Somewhere a mockingbird repeated a whippoorwill's cry, then laughed at its own joke. Jean-Baptiste walked 2 paces behind, carrying nothing. Gaines had taken the valise without being told. The house servants trailed farther back, whispering in rapid Creole the moment their master was out of earshot. Marie-Claire, the laundress, herself the unacknowledged daughter of a Devereaux cousin, crossed herself as she watched the stranger pass. She had seen many things come down that levee road. None of them had ever looked like fallen angels. Anatole did not take Jean-Baptiste to the great house. He led him past the kitchens, past the weaving room, to a small cabin set apart from both the quarters and the main residence. A place for trusted house servants who were still not trusted enough to sleep under the same roof as white women. Inside, 1 room. A narrow iron bed with a cornshuck mattress. A deal table. 1 chair. A cracked mirror above a washstand. The floorboards were clean but warped. Heat rose through the planks like breath from an oven. "This will be your quarters," Anatole said. His voice sounded foreign in his own ears, flat, transactional. "Someone will bring food. You will not leave this cabin tonight. You will speak to no one." Do you understand? Jean-Baptiste stepped inside, looked slowly around the small space that smelled of lye, soap, and old despair, and turned back to his uncle. I understand, monsieur. A pause. May I ask? No. Anatole cut him off. Tomorrow. He left without another word. The door closed with the finality of a coffin lid. Outside, dusk was gathering. The cicadas began their evening shrieks, an ocean of sound that could drown a man's thoughts. Anatole walked back toward the great house, feeling the eyes of every soul on the plantation tracking him. He told himself it was imagination. Inside the cabin, Jean-Baptiste stood motionless for a long time. Then, moving with the calm precision of a man who senses the gallows being built, he opened his valise. He laid his few possessions on the table like sacred relics. 3 shirts, meticulously mended. A volume of Montaigne, spine cracked from love. A small French Bible, its leather cover soft as skin. A packet of letters tied with faded ribbon, his father's last words. And most precious of all, the leather portfolio that held his freedom. He opened it with reverent fingers. Birth certificate, baptismal record from St. Sulpice, diploma from the Lycée Louis-le-Grand, letters of recommendation sealed with Sorbonne wax. Every document stamped, signed, notarized, irrefutable proof that Jean-Baptiste Christophe Devereaux had been born free in the eyes of God and French law. He stared at them until the words blurred. Then, acting on an instinct older than reason, he took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, in tiny, perfect script, an exact inventory of every document, every date, every seal. When he finished, he folded the inventory small and slid it between the sewn binding of the Montaigne, deep in the spine where no casual search would ever find it. Only then did he allow himself to sit. The chair creaked beneath him like an old man's bones. Through the single window, he could see the great house, its windows glowing gold. Somewhere inside, his uncle was calculating profit margins on a human soul. Jean-Baptiste closed his eyes. For the first time since leaving Paris, he prayed. Not the elegant Latin prayers of his childhood, but the raw, desperate plea of a man who feels the jaws of the trap beginning to close. Outside, the cicadas screamed louder, as if the very insects knew what tomorrow would bring. And somewhere far upriver, the Mississippi kept rolling, carrying secrets older than the Devereaux, older than Louisiana itself, carrying them south toward the city, where men in fine coats would soon bid on a miracle they could never be allowed to keep. Because some sins are so perfectly calculated, they look almost like providence. The morning of Friday, April 4th, 1852, broke over Riviero chain like the opening of a wound. Jean-Baptiste had not slept. He had sat at the small table all night, candle burned down to a stub, staring at the spine of his Montaigne where the hidden inventory of his freedom now lived. Every creak of the cabin, every distant bark of a dog, every sigh of the river sounded like footsteps coming to take him. At 8 o'clock sharp, Anatole sent for him. The great house felt colder than the night air. Sunlight poured through the tall French windows, but it carried no warmth, only the merciless clarity of Judgment Day. In the study, the portraits of dead Devereaux watched like a jury of ghosts. Jean-Baptiste carried the leather portfolio in hands that did not tremble. He had decided, sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, that he would not beg. He would not cry. He would give his uncle the dignity of pretending this was merely business. Anatole sat behind the cypress desk, immaculate in dove-gray waistcoat and cravat, the perfect picture of Creole restraint. The drawer where he would soon lock away a man's life stood open like a hungry mouth. "Place the documents here," he said in French, not looking up from his ledger. Jean-Baptiste laid the portfolio down as if it were the body of his father. For 20 long minutes Anatole examined every page. He held the baptismal certificate to the light, searching for watermarks. He ran a finger along the wax seals, as though testing whether they might melt under pressure. He made small notes in a leather-bound book, dates, issuing authorities, notary names. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. At last he closed the portfolio and slid it into the drawer. The key turned with a soft, decisive click. "They appear authentic," he said, voice smooth as river silt. I will keep them here for safekeeping. Jean-Baptiste felt the floor tilt beneath him, though his feet never moved. Anatole leaned back, folding manicured hands across his waistcoat. He spoke slowly, the way one explains gravity to a child who has just fallen from a tree. You are my brother's son. I gave Christophe my word I would provide for you. But you must understand the delicacy of your situation. He let the silence stretch until it became its own accusation. Your mother was colored. Under the laws of Louisiana, laws written in blood and upheld by every court from here to Washington, that single fact erases every other. Paris may call you free. Louisiana calls you property. If I introduced you as my nephew, my daughter's marriages would collapse. My credit at the banks would vanish overnight. My name, our name, would become a joke whispered in every salon from the Treme to the Faubourg Saint Mary. He paused, letting the weight settle. I am not without Christian mercy. You will live here. You will eat at my table's leavings. You will serve as my private secretary, correspondence, translations, the French accounts my American overseer cannot read. You will occupy the cabin you slept in last night. And in exchange, he leaned forward, eyes glittering like river ice. You will never speak of Paris. You will never speak of your father. You will never speak of those papers locked in my drawer. To every soul on this plantation and in the city beyond, you are simply Jean-Baptiste. A light-skinned fancy I purchased privately. Nothing more. The word fancy hung in the air like the stench of the sugar mill. Sweet, rotten, impossible to ignore. Jean-Baptiste heard his own heartbeat in his ears, steady and furious. You are asking me, he said, voice low but clear, to volunteer for chains that are already waiting for me. I am asking you to be practical, Anatole replied without blinking. French papers are fairy tales here. Without my protection, you would last less than a week before some speculator clapped you in irons, and no court in Louisiana would lift a finger. Free people of color vanish every day, Jean-Baptiste. Their papers burn very nicely in plantation stoves. He smiled then, a small, tidy smile that never reaches eyes. I'm offering you the only freedom available, the freedom to survive. Accept, and you live as my secretary, fed, clothed, useful. Refuse, and I return your portfolio with $50 and my heartfelt wish for your good fortune in a city that eats boys like you before breakfast. He sat back again, the picture of reasonable benevolence. Jean-Baptiste looked at the locked drawer. He looked at the portrait of his grandfather glaring down in judgment. He looked at his uncle's soft, manicured hands, hands that had never held a machete, never felt the bite of a whip, yet were about to sign away a life. He thought of his father coughing blood into silk handkerchiefs in a New York boarding house, trusting his only child to the mercy of a brother who had none. He thought of the Mississippi outside, vast and indifferent, carrying bodies and secrets south to the sea. I accept, he said. The words tasted like rust. Anatole's smile widened a fraction. He opened a fresh ledger, thick cream paper, Moroccan leather binding, and began to write in his beautiful, lethal cursive. Acquired April 3rd, 1852, by private sale. One mulatto male, age 23. Name, Jean-Baptiste, no surname. Height 6 feet 1 inch. Complexion near white, eyes green gold. Literate in 4 languages, suitable for domestic service and secretarial duties. Estimated value, $2,000. He blotted the ink, closed the book, and looked up. There, you now exist exactly as Louisiana wishes you to exist. Jean-Baptiste felt something inside him calcify, something that had once been hope. May I ask one question, monsieur? Anatole inclined his head. When you received my father's letter, when you invited me here, was mercy ever part of your intention? Or was I merchandise from the moment you recognized the prophet in my face? For the first time, something flickered across Anatole's features. Regret, perhaps, or merely indigestion. I intended, he said carefully, to do what was practical for the family. He rose. Cool me. I will show you your office. And just like that, Jean-Baptiste Christophe Devereaux, Sorbonne scholar, son of Paris, heir to nothing, ceased to exist. For 5 weeks the mask held. He worked in a small room off the study that smelled of ink and old paper. He translated contracts with Bordeaux wine houses. He drafted letters to Parisian banks in handwriting so elegant it made grown men jealous. He balanced accounts that would have baffled most white planters twice his age. Anatole began, almost despite himself, to rely on him. He would pace the study dictating terms, then pause. What do you think of Claiborne's new tariff proposal? Will the Prussian situation affect cotton prices? Is this clause with the Havana factor airtight? And Jean-Baptiste would answer, quietly, precisely, never presuming equality, yet never hiding the brilliance that made the questions necessary in the first place. Sometimes late at night, Anatole would pour 2 glasses of Madeira and slide one across the desk. They would sit in silence while the house slept, uncle and nephew bound by blood and betrayal, drinking to nothing. The house servants watched the strange dance with the wariness of people who had seen every kind of cruelty dressed as kindness. Marie-Claire left extra portions of gumbo outside his cabin door. Old Eunice, the cook, taught him which herbs ease the ache of Louisiana heat. Thomas, the stable hand, slipped him a worn copy of Les Miserables smuggled from a free-colored barber in the city. They never spoke of escape. They all knew the river and the swamp, and the dogs made it impossible. But they honored, in their small ways, the humanity Anatole had tried to erase. Jean-Baptiste wrote letters he never sent. My dearest father, I'm safe. I am treated with consideration. Your brother remembers his promise. The sugar cane grows tall here, and the river sings at night. I think of you constantly. I pray the medicine brings you peace. He folded each letter into perfect squares and hid them beneath a loose floorboard with the remaining pages of his unsent soul. Then came Wednesday, May 7th. Anatole decided on a whim to bring his secretary to New Orleans. Contracts to sign, reputations to polish, a quiet display of cosmopolitan sophistication. They traveled downriver on the steamboat Louisiana Belle. Jean-Baptiste, standing at the rail in a new black coat Anatole, had provided. You must look the part, watching the plantations slide past like green cathedrals built on graves. New Orleans hit him like absinthe and incense. The levee boiled with languages, French, Spanish, English, Choctaw, the liquid Creole that was all of them and none. Barefoot stevedores rolled hogsheads of sugar. Elegant quadroon women in tignons of Madras silk glided past like bright birds. Priests and prostitutes shared the same banquet. At every meeting the reaction was identical. Conversation faltered. Eyes turned. Breaths caught. In the oak-paneled study of Philippe Laroche, the merchant's wife circled Jean-Baptiste like a cat assessing cream. Monsieur Devereaux, she murmured in French, that young man, he is yours? A recent acquisition, Anatole replied smoothly. My secretary. I have never seen such perfection in servitude, she said, voice husky. Would you consider an offer? At the home of Madame Helene Faucher, wealthy widow, connoisseur of beautiful things, the bidding began in earnest. 5,000, she whispered when the men stepped outside for cigars. Cash. Tonight. No questions. Anatole laughed it away, but the number lodged in his brain like a bullet. On the return journey, he stood at the stern, watching the wake churn white, and did mathematics the way other men prayed. $5,000. Perhaps 6 at the St. Louis Hotel Rotunda, where the fancy trade paraded its masterpieces. Enough to buy 200 prime field hands. Enough to marry his youngest daughter into the governor's family. Enough to erase forever the dangerous living proof of Christophe's sin. That night, he rewrote the ledger. Estimated value, $5,000 to $7,000. Sunday, May 10th. Jean-Baptiste was reading Montaigne by the light of a single candle when the door opened without a knock. Anatole entered first, followed by Gaines and a house servant named Lyon who carried a length of chain that glinted like a smile. The air in the small cabin turned metallic. I've decided to sell you, Anatole announced in French, calm as discussing the weather. The auction is May 14th at the St. Louis Hotel. You will fetch a price that reflects your unique qualities. The book slipped from Jean-Baptiste's fingers and struck the floor like a gunshot. "You gave me your word," he said, voice raw. "You swore this was temporary." "And it has been," Anatole replied. "5 comfortable weeks. Now you will go to a fine house in the city. Indoors, cultured company, perhaps even a piano. Many would call it an improvement." Jean-Baptiste rose slowly. The candle flame trembled between them. "I am not property to be improved." "You are whatever Louisiana says you are," Anatole answered. "Your papers are in my safe. Your mother's blood is in your veins. The law has already spoken." He took one step closer. "Cooperate, and you'll be treated gently. Resist, and Gaines will bind you. The choice is yours." Jean-Baptiste looked at the chain in Lyon's hands. He looked at Gaines's pale eyes, shining with anticipation. He looked at his uncle, blood of his blood, and saw nothing human left. He thought of running, of fighting, of dying rather than mounting that block. But the river was miles away, and the dogs would sing all night. "I will cooperate," he said. The words came out steady. Only he and God heard them break. Anatole nodded once. "We leave Wednesday. Rest. Bathe. Present yourself well. Your future depends on it." They left. The key turned in the lock like the closing of tomb. Jean-Baptiste stood in the center of the cabin while the candle burned lower, guttering in its own wax. He did not cry. He did not pray. He knelt, pried up the loose floorboard, and took out every letter he had written to his father. One by one, he fed them to the flame. The paper curled black, words of love, and lies rising as smoke through the cracks in the roof. When the last ash settled, he whispered into the darkness the only vow left to him. "They will remember my name." Outside, the cicadas screamed like witnesses who could never testify. And 4 days later, on a dais beneath the crystal chandeliers of the St. Louis Hotel, the most beautiful man ever sold in New Orleans would step into history wearing chains he was born too free to bear. Because some betrayals are so complete, they become scripture. The night before the auction, Jean-Baptiste did not sleep. He did not rage. He did not pray. He wrote. By the light of a single tallow candle that painted trembling shadows on the barred wall, he took the last clean sheet of paper in his possession and began to write in the precise, elegant French of the Palais de Justice. Every stroke of the pen was a nail in someone's coffin. He wrote for 3 hours without pause. He wrote of the steamboat that carried him south like a lamb to slaughter. He wrote of the uncle who greeted him with a smile sharp as a machete. He wrote of the locked drawer that swallowed his freedom. He wrote of the ledger entry that rewrote his soul in ink worth $2,000. He wrote of the journey to New Orleans, of the eyes that devoured him in fine parlors, of the moment Anatole's greed finally outran his caution. He dated it. He signed it with the full name he was about to lose forever. Jean-Baptiste Christophe Devereaux, citizen of France, born free. When he finished, the candle was a melted stub and his hand cramped into a claw. He folded the letter small, slid it deep into the split spine of his Montaigne, next to the hidden inventory of documents now locked in his uncle's safe, and lay down fully dressed on the narrow cot. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the city breathing outside the bars. Somewhere a church bell tolled 3. Somewhere a drunk sang a filthy song in Spanish. Somewhere the Mississippi kept its ancient counsel. He thought of his father, probably already cold in a pauper's grave in New York, believing to his last rattling breath that Anatole would protect his only child. He thought of his mother, dead of cholera in 48, who had taught him that dignity was the one thing no one could steal unless you handed it over yourself. Then he made the decision that would either save him or damn him forever. If they were determined to sell him, he would not go quietly into that good night. Dawn came red as judgment. At 8 o'clock the door opened, and Gaines entered with a tray, coffee, biscuit, a white linen shirt pressed to knife-edge creases. Anatole's orders. The merchandise must look its best. Jean-Baptiste washed in cold water, shaved with a borrowed razor, dressed in the clothes of a prince about to be crucified. The shirt was open at the throat. The black trousers hugged his long legs. The boots gleamed like obsidian. His hair, trimmed 2 days earlier by the plantation barber, was brushed back from his forehead, revealing the perfect bone structure that had already cost him everything. Gaines looked at him, and for once said nothing. Even a man who bought and sold flesh for a living could feel the weight of sacrilege. At 10 o'clock, they walked him through the lobby of the St. Louis Hotel. The rotunda rose above them like the inside of a cathedral built to worship money. Marble columns soared 4 stories to a dome of colored glass that turned the morning light into liquid gold. Crystal chandeliers the size of wagons hung like frozen explosions. The air smelled of cigar smoke, bergamot, and fear. And every soul in the place stopped breathing when Jean-Baptiste appeared. Women in silk and feathers forgot their fans mid-flutter. Men in frock coats and diamond pins forgot their bids. A dowager in the front row actually crossed herself. He was luminous. Not beautiful, luminous. As though the light loved him too much to let him go. Anatole walked half a pace ahead, face rigid with triumph. He had dressed carefully, too. Charcoal coat, snow-white waistcoat, the silver-headed cane that announced old blood and older money. Today, the Devereaux name would be whispered in every salon from the View Care to the Garden District. They led Jean-Baptiste up the 3 marble steps to the block. The platform was cold beneath his boots. He stood in the exact center, hands loose at his sides, and fixed his gaze on a point just above the heads of the crowd, so no one could say later he had looked down in submission. The auctioneer, Monsieur Perrault, 50 years in the trade, voice like a sermon, mounted the podium. His practiced smile faltered for half a heartbeat when he truly saw what stood before him. Then professionalism reasserted itself. Mesdames et messieurs, an offering without equal in the annals of this house. He began in English, repeated in French, his words rolling out like velvet over broken glass. Age 23. Fluent in 4 languages, literate in Greek. Trained in secretarial arts, bookkeeping, the piano. Temperament gentle, health perfect, appearance. Perrault paused, searching for a word that would not sound blasphemous. Appearance unparalleled. Opening bid, $2,000. The first paddle went up before the echo died. 2,200. 2,500. 3,000. The numbers climbed like a fever. At 5,000, Madame Helene Faucher entered the fray, voice cutting through the murmur like a diamond across glass. She sat in the front row in morning black that only made her hunger more obvious. 6,000. 7. 8. At 9,000, only 2 remained. Madame Faucher and Philippe Laroche, the commission merchant whose wife had first tasted the forbidden fruit of desire in her own parlor. 10,000. 10,500. 11,000. Madame Faucher, standing now, gloved hand trembling with victory. The rotunda held its breath. Perrault lifted his gavel, eyes shining with the romance of commerce. Do I hear 11,500? 11,000 going once. Jean-Baptiste turned his head, slowly, deliberately, as if the entire world had narrowed to this single moment God had always intended. And he spoke. 3 words. Quiet. Perfect Parisian French, carrying to the last row because the room had fallen into the kind of silence that happens only when history leans in to listen. Je suis libre. I am free. For one eternal second, no one moved. Then chaos detonated. A woman screamed. A man cursed in Creole. Paddles clattered to the marble like bones. Anatole lunged forward, face purple. You lying bastard. Perrault's gavel froze midair. Jean-Baptiste did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every syllable fell like a stone into still water. My name is Jean-Baptiste Christophe Devereaux. I am the son of Christophe Devereaux and the lawful nephew of Anatole Devereaux, who stands before you. I was born free in Paris, March 12, 1829, and baptized at St. Sulpice. I hold French citizenship. I arrived in Louisiana on April 3rd at my uncle's written invitation. Upon my arrival, he seized my documents, birth certificate, baptismal record, Sorbonne attestations, and entered me fraudulently into his plantation ledger as property. This sale is a crime under the laws of France, Louisiana, and God himself. Every person who bids, every person who lifts that gavel, purchases not a slave, but a kidnapping. The silence that followed was so complete they could hear the ticking of Perrault's pocket watch. Then a new voice, calm, educated, pure, metropolitan French, cut through from the side aisle. Monsieur l'huissier, un moment s'il vous plaît. A tall man in severe black pushed through the crowd. That he carried the tricolor cockade in his lapel and authority like a sword. François Mercier, attaché au Consulat de France. We received this morning a letter written in the hand of Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Devereaux, detailing every circumstance of his illegal detention. We have verified his birth registration in the archives of the city of Paris. We have copies of his baptismal certificate and his father's marriage lines. Under Article 3 of the Franco-American Consular Convention of 1853, yes, gentlemen, the treaty already in force, France claims jurisdiction over her citizens. This sale is suspended forthwith. Any attempt to proceed will be considered an act of war against the French Republic. He laid a thick dossier on the podium with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Anatole found his voice at last. He pulled papers from his coat, the very documents he had confiscated, waving them like a battle flag. Forgeries. This boy is the son of my own slave, Celeste, who died on my plantation in 1848. He has been indulged with an education and fed fantasies of Parisian nobility. I brought him here in Christian charity. Mercier never raised his voice. We also possess a 15-page deposition, delivered to the consulate at dawn by a trusted intermediary, written in the same hand as the letter. It cites Montaigne, Pascal, and the Code Napoleon with chapter and verse. It names dates, witnesses, ledger entries. Copies have already been dispatched to the governor, the attorney general, and Le Moniteur in Paris. Monsieur Devereaux, you may explain your charity to a court-martial. The gavel came down, not to seal a sale, but to end one. Perrault's voice cracked like an adolescent's. This auction is suspended pending full legal review. The individual will be removed to the custody of the city parish prison. No, gentlemen, not as a slave, as a material witness. All bids are void. 2 constables stepped forward. They did not bring irons. They told the entire room everything they needed to know. As they took his elbow, gently, almost respectfully, Jean-Baptiste passed within arm's reach of his uncle. Anatole's eyes were wild, veins livid at his temples. His mouth worked soundlessly, as though the words had turned to gall. Jean-Baptiste stopped, looked at him, and in the softest possible voice, so only Anatole could hear, "Dites à mon père que j'ai tenu parole." Tell my father I kept my word. Then he walked down the steps of the block a free man for the first time since setting foot on Louisiana soil, while the most powerful families in New Orleans watched their world crack along a single, perfect fault line. Behind him, the rotunda erupted into a storm of French, English, and raw human panic. $11,000, evaporated like morning mist, a reputation older than the state itself, shattered like crystal beneath a boot heel. And somewhere beyond the dome, church bells began to ring the Angelus, as if heaven itself had finally taken notice of what was done in its name. Because some truths are so bright, they burn the eyes of everyone who tried to sell them. The iron door of the cabildo closed behind him with the dull finality of a coffin lid. May 17th, 1852, 3 days after the auction. 3 days of questions, of lawyers circling like buzzards, of documents passed beneath oil lamps while the city outside burned with rumor. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux stepped onto the place d'armes carrying nothing but the clothes on his back, a battered leather trunk, and a piece of paper that declared him neither slave nor free. The sun struck him like a physical blow. He stood motionless for a long moment, letting the heat soak through the linen shirt, letting the noise of the city, vendors shouting in 3 languages, carriage wheels on cobblestone, the distant moan of a steamboat, wash over him like baptismal water. He was alive. He was breathing. And for the first time in 74 days, no one owned him. But the taste of freedom was strange, metallic like blood on the tongue. Behind him, the cabildo's shadow stretched long across the square. In front of him, New Orleans shimmered like a fever dream. He had $8 in his pocket. Payment, Anatole's lawyer had said with a thin smile, for services rendered. 8 pieces of silver for 3 months of his life. He opened the trunk right there on the banquette, under the eyes of passing strangers. Inside, his Montaigne, spine still secretly pregnant with truth. His father's last letters. The French Bible his mother had pressed into his hands the day he left Paris. And folded carefully on top, returned without ceremony. His original documents, now bearing the faint creases of Anatole's lying fingers. He closed the trunk. He did not look back. He walked through the view care, past cafes where men who had bid $11,000 for his body now drank coffee and pretended not to see him. Past the cathedral where bells were ringing none, the same bells that had tolled while he stood on the block. Past the levee where steamboats belched smoke and dreams northward. He kept walking until the city thinned and the river road opened before him like a wound. Then he vanished. No one saw him board a boat. No one saw him buy a ticket. No one saw him look back. He simply ceased to be Jean-Baptiste Devereaux, the most beautiful man ever sold in Louisiana, and became someone else entirely. History lost him there, on a dusty road under a merciless sun. But legends are harder to kill than men. Anatole returned to Rivière-aux-Chains a ruined king. The great house still stood white and proud, but something inside it had died. The galleries echoed differently. The portraits of ancestors seemed to watch him with new accusation. His daughters' letters from their fine marriages grew cooler, shorter. Invitations to the best homes stopped arriving. He told anyone who would listen that the boy had been delusional, that French forgeries were common, that he had acted only to protect family honor. But New Orleans has a long memory and a sharp tongue. In the salons they no longer said Monsieur Devereaux tried to sell a slave who claimed to be free. They said, Monsieur Devereaux tried to sell his own nephew. The difference was everything. He began to age overnight. His hair went white at the temples first, then all at once like frost on a window pane. He took to walking the galleries at night, speaking French to shadows. He kept a loaded pistol in his bedside drawer. He tripled the dogs. He paid informants in the city to watch for a tall young man with green gold eyes and a scholar's hands. They found nothing. 7 years passed. A package arrived at Rivière-aux-Chains on a morning heavy with rain. No return address. Postmark, Montreal. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was a book. A first edition of Le Comte de Monte Cristo. Dumas, 1844, bound in crimson morocco, gilt edges still bright. Anatole opened it with trembling fingers. On the flyleaf, written in the same elegant, lethal hand that had once balanced his ledgers, were 6 words in black ink. Frappe, mon frère. Nous sommes frères. Strike, my brother. We are brothers. Beneath it, a line from the novel. Nous qui avons souffert de la même plaie. We who have suffered from the same wound. Anatole's hands shook so violently the book fell to the floor. His youngest daughter, Marguerite, 17, curious, and already keeping a diary that would outlive them all, picked it up. She read the inscription. She saw her father's face drain of blood. That night, he burned the book in the marble fireplace of the great parlor. He stood watching until the last page curled black and the gilt edges melted into nothing. But Marguerite had already copied the words in her diary. And diaries, like legends, have a way of surviving fire. Anatole's decline accelerated. He began seeing the boy everywhere, leaning against a column on the gallery, standing at the foot of his bed, walking the levee road at twilight with that same calm, unbreakable stride. He would wake screaming in French. Je t'ai donné un abri. J'ai fait ce qu'il fallait. I gave you shelter. I did what was necessary. The house servants, Marie Claire, old Eunice, even Thomas, who had carried the letter, heard him arguing with ghosts. In April 1862, when Farragut's guns thundered upriver and the stars and stripes rose over the city, Anatole Devereaux was already a dead man walking. He died on the 29th of that month, 3 days after New Orleans surrendered. The doctor wrote, nervous exhaustion and melancholia. The servants whispered something closer to the truth. He died of being seen. They buried him beneath the live oaks his father had planted, in a tomb that bore the proud Devereaux crest. No one came from the city. His daughters sent black-bordered letters and nothing more. And somewhere, in a place cold enough that beauty was only beauty and not a brand, a man who had once been Jean-Baptiste Devereaux closed a book, looked out at snow falling on a river that did not remember the Mississippi, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to smile. We do not know his new name. We do not know if he married, if he had children, if he ever spoke French again, or only in the careful, neutral English of a man hiding in plain sight. We know only this. In 1854, a letter arrived at the French consulate in New Orleans. One sheet of paper, no signature but the initials JBD. It read in part, Je suis vivant, je suis libre. Dites à ceux qui m'ont aidé que la dette est acquittée, et que la mémoire, parfois, est la plus douce des vengeances. I am alive. I am free. Tell those who helped me the debt is paid, and that memory, sometimes, is the sweetest revenge. In 1897, a 93-year-old woman named Henriette Blanchard told a researcher, I was there. I saw him. He stood on that block like a prince in chains. And when he said, Je suis libre, it wasn't a plea. It was a coronation. She was asked if she believed he escaped. Madame Blanchard laughed, a sound like dry leaves. Child, she said, he didn't escape. He simply stopped letting them write his story. There's a difference. And in the Louisiana State Archives, behind a door marked restricted access, a folder gathers dust. It is labeled in fading ink. St. Louis Hotel Auction, May 14, 1852. Devereaux versus Devereaux, status undetermined. Sealed by order of the legislature, 1853. Do not open. Every decade or so, a historian files a petition. Every petition is denied. The reason given is always the same. Privacy concerns for potentially living descendants. But Jean-Baptiste will be 196 years old today. So someone, somewhere, is still afraid of what those pages might say. Maybe they contain the bill of sale that never was. Maybe they contain the testimony of witnesses who were paid to lie. Maybe they contain a forwarding address, a new name, a death certificate from a city where no one ever asked about a drop of blood. Or maybe they contain the last letter Jean-Baptiste ever wrote, the one he sent not to the consulate, not to the newspapers, but to the only person who needed to read it. A letter that begins, Mon oncle, vous m'avez appris que l'homme peut tout vendre, même ce qui ne lui appartient pas. Je vous ai appris qu'il y a des choses que l'on ne peut ni vendre, ni acheter, ni effacer. Vous vivrez avec cela. Moi, je vivrai sans. My uncle, you taught me that a man can sell anything, even what does not belong to him. I taught you that there are things that cannot be sold, bought, or erased. You will live with that. I will live without. We will never know, because some stories are not meant to end with answers. They are meant to end with silence. The kind of silence that falls when a man walks away from his own auction block and refuses ever again to be priced. Somewhere tonight, in a city cold enough to forget Louisiana, a descendant who does not know his own bloodline might open a drawer and find an old French Bible with a pressed magnolia blossom between the pages and handwriting on the flyleaf that says simply, Pour que tu saches d'où vient ta liberté, so that you will know where your freedom comes from. And somewhere else, in a sealed vault in Baton Rouge, a folder waits. It waits for the day someone is brave enough to open it and read the last chapter of story. That began with $11,000 and ended with a man walking north at dawn, finger to his lips, carrying nothing but his name, and the absolute certainty that no one would ever take it from him again, because he had already paid the price, and the price was everything.